Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the fourth ILR Briefly live event on COVID-19 related liability issues. Last week, we had a great discussion with Deputy Attorney General Jeff Rosen about the Justice Department's enforcement priorities in response to, among other things, coronavirus-related fraud. And the week before, we talked about what Congress and the administration could do to address the ever-growing litigation concerns that seem to be getting louder each and every day. We've had some great conversations so far, and I think we've got all the ingredients today to keep this momentum moving forward. In 1932, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis famously described the states as laboratories of democracy. This remark certainly rings true now as governors and state legislatures across the country respond to the emerging liability threats arising from this unprecedented pandemic. It started with governors in places like New York, Illinois, and Michigan issuing executive orders extending lawsuit protections to frontline healthcare workers. And state legislatures have acted pretty quickly in places like Kentucky and in North Carolina. More on that soon. It's important to note that what the states are doing is an important complement to what Congress is currently considering as part of creating liability protections. This should be addressed comprehensively as the challenges we see really require an all-hands-on-deck approach. For decades, ILR has led an active state program focused on enacting a number of legal reforms. We do it by working with a strong network of allies from state and local chambers to in-state civil justice groups. This network is now more important than ever to ensure that COVID-19 related legal reforms are pursued with purpose, with communication, and of course, coordination. But before we get started, I'll just mention some quick housekeeping rules for those of you joining us for the very first time. We're going to start off with an initial conversation with our two guests, then open things up for viewer Q&A. And if you look at your sidebar, it's a chat bar there, and you want to ask a question, you can ask that question during the course of this entire webinar, and we'll make sure to address them at the end if time permits. As we did with our Federal Briefly event about 2 weeks ago, we're going to be releasing a white paper that focuses specifically on solutions that state governments should consider when tackling these looming liability threats. So to get this conversation going, I'm going to turn things over to John Abegg, ILR's Executive Vice President. John has been heading up a big piece of our COVID-19 response efforts. He spent decades working on Capitol Hill for Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and despite his work here in Washington, John is getting fully immersed in the fast-moving world of state legislation and working closely with Nathan Morris, who many of you know runs the ILR state program. So with that said, let me turn the controls over to John.
Thanks, Harold. Looking back at the last 2 months, we've seen governors and state legislators all over the country play a critically important role in addressing the myriad challenges presented by the pandemic. And that has included taking executive action and passing legislation to mitigate the incoming wave of civil litigation linked to COVID-19. North Carolina made news on that front 2 weeks ago when Governor Roy Cooper signed legislation limiting COVID-19 related liabilities for the healthcare industry, for essential businesses, and for first responders. And Kentucky was one of the first states in the country to officially recognize the liability risks of the pandemic when its legislature passed a bill back in March to create liability protections for healthcare providers treating COVID-19 patients and for businesses that retooled to produce personal protective equipment. To talk with us today about why these protections are important and how they should be extended across the country, I'm happy to welcome two legal reform veterans, Ashli Watts, President and CEO of the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, and Gary Salamido, President and CEO of the North Carolina Chamber. Before stepping into her current role as President of the Kentucky Chamber, Ashli led the Chamber's Public Affairs Shop, where she was instrumental in achieving workers' compensation reform and defending employment arbitration in her state. Gary's also an old hand when it comes to civil justice issues, with some major wins under his belt on asbestos transparency and nuisance litigation, not to mention the 10 years he spent on legal reform as Director of State Government Affairs for GlaxoSmithKline. Thank you both for joining us today. Ashli, I'd like to start things off with you. Like I mentioned a moment ago, Kentucky was one of the first states to enact targeted protections against COVID-related lawsuits. First, can you talk about those protections? And second, I'm curious, even though you've moved forward with some limits on litigation, how concerned are businesses in your state about COVID-related lawsuits as they prepare for the next phase of reopening?
Well, thank you, John, for having me, and thank you to everyone participating in this. It definitely is the topic of the day. I think here in Kentucky, when we're talking to businesses, we just started our reopening this week, kind of phase one, with manufacturing and construction and some office buildings back open. And then over the next couple of weeks, we'll have retail and restaurant kind of in a phased-in approach. And so we were kind of, I guess, in a weird way, lucky that we were in the middle of a legislative session when all of this broke. And so any of us involved in government affairs, it was a very weird time. We had to lobby the last couple of weeks of session remotely. People were voting remotely, but it did give us the avenue to pass a COVID recovery bill. And so in that way, we were kind of fortunate on the timing of all of this. A special session did not have to be called or anything like that. And so in the last couple of weeks of session, right after all of this kind of broke, and middle of March, I guess, is when it was, the Senate president here in Kentucky called me and the lobbyists at the chamber and said, we really need to figure out what we need to do for businesses, in the last couple of weeks of session to help combat what we know is going to happen. And so we pulled together several lawyers that are members of the chamber and represent employers throughout the state. And we kind of put our heads together for a weekend, actually. And so what do we need to do to kind of help provide some protection for employers and to kind of navigate this? And this was mid-March, so a lot of it was very uncharted territory. And I would say, the one thing we knew we needed to do was to protect those frontline workers and also protect the manufacturers who were going to retool to make the PPE. And we all say PPE like it rolls off our tongue these days. And I always say, this was an acronym 2 months ago, none of us probably really knew. So we were kind of very early on in this. I think we might have been one of the first states to really pass a bill relating to COVID recovery. But Kentucky is a manufacturing state. We are home to Ford, Toyota, GM, GE, and all of these manufacturers were going to kind of start retooling to making the masks and the gloves and all the other necessary equipment that they needed to do. And if you guys have worked with manufacturers, you know that when you make a car, it usually goes through about a year or so of testing to make sure that everything is as solid as it can be. And here we were, basically, the government and others asking for these manufacturers within just a couple weeks to produce life-saving equipment. And so we really worked hard with attorneys. We looked at the PrEP Act, the federal PrEP Act, really saying, like, what can we do to protect these manufacturers when they're going to be retooling to making the N95 masks and other forms of PPE. We also absolutely wanted to make sure that we were protecting our frontline workers, all the doctors and the nurses and the techs that were working on the front lines with the coronavirus. And so we were able to pass kind of a COVID-19 recovery bill. We took another bill, a shell of it, and made sure that we had the language that we wanted in there. And it really did pass on an overwhelmingly bipartisan, unanimous vote. And the governor here in Kentucky, just for a little bit of context, is a Democrat. But we are a super majority Republican legislature. And so it was a little bit of an interesting dynamic, but the governor was very supportive of this bill. It also codified, it put into statute many of his executive orders from the very early days of kind of the COVID-19 crisis, things dealing with unemployment insurance and the waiting period and several other things like that. It did codify those. So it was really kind of a good vehicle to make sure that we had everything we needed at that time to protect us. But again, this was passed in, I think it was very late March or the very first days of April. So it was very early on, but it did give us those protections that we needed to really move forward. So that is a great groundwork here in Kentucky. But now that we started our reopening, one of the top questions we have from businesses, besides what PPE do they need, is how am I going to be protected? And so we have been working very closely with the governor and his office here in Kentucky to make sure that all the requirements really are black and white. We don't want any gray areas. We want to know what laws all businesses need to follow. So we've really helped with the requirements and kind of recommendations on that. And businesses absolutely want to make sure that they are keeping everyone, their employees, employees, their patrons, their customers, all Kentuckians safe. But there is some fear. We've heard some kind of rumblings of, if I go to work and for some reason I catch coronavirus or something happens, I will sue my employer, even though they're taking every precaution. And I would say Kentucky's restrictions are quite vast. That we are pretty secure when it comes to all of our protections, but it's definitely something that's front of mind for employers. We recently did a survey last week with a pollster, not just a survey of our membership, but of all Kentuckians. Basically saying, with the protections that employers are going to have to provide and the rules and restrictions that we're going to have to comply with, do you feel comfortable returning to work? And the response was over 80% said yes, they are ready to return to work, they feel safe. And so we're really just working with employers to make sure that all of these protections that they are doing for their employees and their patrons are being communicated. I do think the onus is on the business community to effectively communicate the protections they are providing to make sure that everyone stays well. But that is definitely a concern. We've been working with your former boss, John, Leader McConnell, on hopefully a federal package that I'm sure we'll talk more about later. And then today our Attorney General joined kind of a group of other Attorney Generals throughout the United States, really calling on Congress to include legal liability reform in the next COVID-19 recovery package. So we've taken some steps here in Kentucky, but there definitely are more to go.
Well, Ashli, thank you for that context and for the insights into the process that you went through and how you were able to achieve in a really expeditious way some important reforms. Gary, I'd like to get your perspective on that question. Businesses all over North Carolina are working to respond to the pandemic, including in the world-leading science and technology firms in the Research Triangle. How are businesses responding to the liability reforms that North Carolina put in place a couple of weeks ago, and do you think more needs to be done?
Well, thank you, John, and it's a pleasure to be with the folks at ILR again, and it's good to see you, Ashli. We met a little while ago, but it's been some time now, and congratulations on the good work in Kentucky. Really good work. Yeah, we had a similar background here in context that Ashli was experiencing in Kentucky. It was thrust upon us pretty quick, though. Our governor threw us into a shelter in place without real clarity for pretty quickly with it. So when that happened, our manufacturers went to work pretty quickly to try and figure out, okay, how do we make personal protective equipment pretty quick? How do we begin to get our healthcare folks what they need in order to take care of folks? The first thing, as Ashli pointed out, it was the same here, and it is for manufacturers and businesses. The number one priority is people's safety, right? So number one for our manufacturers and for our businesses is how do we protect our people who are going to be taking care of folks? How do we protect our people who are going to be producing personal protective equipment for our healthcare professionals that are on that front line? And we really didn't know, a lot of us really didn't know what we were facing or when the surge was going to come. So the businesses in North Carolina, like they did all across the country, and the manufacturers just went out and did the right thing. They did the right thing. They retooled, and they were concerned about their liabilities, but their primary concern at the very beginning was their people and the citizens of their state and their customers with it. They communicated to us what their concerns were early on. We were in good communication. Historically, we've had great relationship here dating back to the tort and civil liability reforms in around 2011 with the medical community. So the medical community was working closely already to make sure that what they were doing had some protections in place too. So it kind of all came together for us at the end. And the businesses now, we were able to get some really good pieces in there that will say, unless it's gross negligence, unless it's gross misconduct or willful intent to harm, that for the term of the time that the governor has declared a state of emergency, that we have really good protections here in North Carolina for our healthcare workers in 9+ categories that were defined in the legislation, and our essential businesses, those that were deemed essential businesses in the governor's executive order, have the protections that they need in order to take care of people and to take care of their customers and themselves and to give our healthcare workers what they need going forward. So we're really fortunate here. It was bipartisan. Also, folks were pretty well aligned on those things. Is there more to do? Absolutely is more to do. And we can talk a little bit more about some of the things that were some limits on what we did. the businesses now are ready to reopen. And so as they think about what's ready to reopen, how do we protect people and how do we protect our businesses going forward so that we're able to continue to employ those folks, to re-employ folks that need to be employed in a safe and effective way. So we're pleased with where we are, but as everybody in the call knows, and I learned this from Harold a long time ago, we never rest because the opposition never rests. And so we're going to make sure that we're ready and that we're continuing to listen and we're continuing to learn and continuing to advocate for common sense, sensible liability protections for those members of ours and not ours, and those manufacturers out there that are doing the right thing to protect the citizens of North Carolina. So look forward to the discussion. Our folks are worried, but they're also laser focused on protecting their people.
Well, thanks, Gary. We appreciate that background. Ashli, back to you. And you touched on this a little bit in your prior comments about your experience in Kentucky. But one of the most remarkable things about the reforms that you helped pass in your state was the strong bipartisan support behind them. As you noted, the Democratic governor and the Republican attorney general both supported your efforts. Why do you think support for COVID-19 is so bipartisan? Reforms in that area, that is.
Yeah, and it was definitely a change. I think any of us that have been in this field for a while that knows that unfortunately sometimes these things are more on one side of the aisle than the others. However, I think when you're in the middle of a pandemic and you know that you need to get life-saving supplies to people who need it on the front lines, you will do anything it takes to really protect those people. And so I think it was a really good exercise for everyone to see that, you know, these are common sense measures, and we use the term Good Samaritan quite a bit when passing this piece of legislation. And I think it's something that people can really relate to. It's not just like Gary said, we've worked very closely with the medical community here in Kentucky as well over, you know, many years trying to get legal liability reforms. And this was a little bit of a different topic. It wasn't kind of the gross negligence we hear about or kind of the normal tort reform language. It was really about how do we make sure that these manufacturers and our nurses and our doctors can do the job that we're asking them to do and basically putting their lives on the line to make sure other people are protected. And so I think it was a really helpful exercise to see that these are common sense measures. We all know what the right thing to do at that time was, and it was to give our employers protection so that they could not only take care of those that needed to be taken care of, but also completely retool their scope of business to produce, you know, life-saving PPE. So I think basically that storytelling part, and I know I always say I'm kind of a recovering lobbyist at this point, but that storytelling part and putting actual faces and kind of scenarios in front of people instead of just kind of this concept of tort reform and legal liability reform and things that have happened in other states, but sometimes it's hard to really draw the picture in your own state or in your own backyard. Having to say that manufacturer down the street that employs 10,000 people is producing life-saving equipment and they need our help, or our nurses who, you know, everyone has a friend or a family member who is a doctor or a nurse and is going to work every day putting their lives on the line to protect those that we care about. Don't they deserve protection? And so for us, I think it was really that storytelling kind of coming to life. And when you kind of put a real face to it, it's not just kind of this broad issue that we talk about in terms of tort reform. And it's kind of just another topic to check off of the lobbying box, but it really is a real life scenario. So I think that's why, you know, it had success here in Kentucky. And I will tell you, I was amazed that there weren't questions about it. Even in debate during, you know, committee and on the floor, there was no debate that we needed to give those people protection. So I do think it gives us a very good base and a very good example to move forward about how these are not, you know, some one side of the aisle or another policies. It really is very common sense. And I think it's just kind of helped us illustrate what we've been pushing for many, many years.
Gary, I've got a similar question for you. North Carolina's recent reforms also passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Can you talk a little bit about how you work to help build that consensus in North Carolina?
Yeah, thanks. And very, very similar. I mean, they're common sense reforms for people that are putting their lives on the line every day. So we had good support from the very beginning. The folks rallied together when they say, okay, we got something that's unknown and it could hurt people, and people are going to take extraordinary measures. So let's put some common sense things in place that can protect people who are doing extraordinary work. You know, a couple of points that, that are limits, but also were successful. Our folks, our essential businesses and healthcare providers that were identified in the legislation have immunity, but only as long as our executive order for a state of emergency is in place, which is a limitation. It was helpful in that it served immediate need, but it's a limitation. And the personal injury attorneys and are already looking at how do we extend that beyond either before or after with it, by the way we put it together. So yeah, I think it was common sense. It was for a defined period of time when there was a lot of unknown. And so that helped a great deal to get us to a place where we had, good bipartisan support for what's going on with it. We need to do more, and we need to protect, and going forward we will. When we look at time limits, I think we always got to be really careful at what our effective dates are and what the other dates are, because those can be really key in determining when the liability kicks in, a protection kicks in, and when it doesn't, and how artfully you word that is really, really important. So it had a lot to do with doing the right thing. It had a lot to do with working with the medical community in a way that was really to protect folks. It had a way to do in a defined period of time that there was a lot of uncertainty and unknown. So it was a combination of things that helped us to get good, strong bipartisan support, good immunity while we're going through the pandemic crisis for the defined period of time. It did set up some holes for us that we got to continue to fill going forward on effective dates and the definition of limiting to customers and employees, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So some common sense parameters helped a lot.
Well, Gary, I know you've got a more work ahead, but you clearly have a good foundation on which to build. Actually, I want to get your perspective on something. Those who don't support these sorts of targeted liability protections often claim that limiting lawsuits is good for businesses, but it's bad for employees. But previous liability reforms passed by Kentucky have helped both groups. Can you talk a bit about what you've done and how COVID-related liability reforms would benefit businesses, employees, and customers?
Yeah, and just for kind of quick context of what we've been dealing with here in Kentucky, and I know Harold and your team are all too familiar, for about 3 years, I guess, we were a deep red state. We had always been kind of a purple state with our House of Representatives being Democratic, our Senate being Republican, and the governor would kind of flip back and forth every time. And several years ago, we flipped from being kind of a purple state to a deep red state, and we went to supermajority Republican controlled House, Senate, and the governor's office. And so those of us that had been longtime advocates for legal liability reform were pretty excited about this possibility of finally making some waves in this realm. And unfortunately, here in Kentucky, we have not made the progress really on the broad scope that we have wanted to. We've had kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We passed medical review panels. It got overturned by the courts. We've never been able to get broad consensus on caps on economic damages. And so we've really had to kind of go back to the drawing board and kind of chip around the edges to see what we can get with basically the makeup of the body here in Kentucky. And one thing that it's not unique to Kentucky, sadly, I'm sure many states are dealing with it, is the rise of the opioid epidemic. And so here in Kentucky, it is no longer kind of just this thing that you talk about. All of us know or love someone that has struggled with addiction, primarily with the opioid epidemic that's been plaguing Kentucky. And Leader McConnell has been a very strong leader on this to try to see what we can do to help this population. And the chamber, a couple years ago, we took a pretty bold stance, and we started kind of an opioid recovery program. And we actually have 2 employees here at the chamber that their sole purpose is to get people back to work and get them that second chance, and really make sure that employers here in Kentucky are comfortable with hiring people that need a second chance, that have been in treatment, who have been incarcerated. I think people want to do the right thing and try to give those people a second chance. But the number one thing we heard about when we started this program was, I want to hire this person. I really believe in this, but I'm scared of the liability, or it's too big of a risk. What if something happens? What if they relapse? What if they show up on the job and something happens? I will be held liable, and that's just kind of something, a path they did not want to go down. And so we realized that was the biggest impediment to getting, tens of thousands of people here in Kentucky back to work and on a good path. And so we worked very closely with members of the legislature, members of the recovery community, people that were running recovery centers, medical professionals. We kind of put together this opioid task force and said, policy-wise, what do we need to do? We kind of know programmatic-wise how to tackle this, but the big thing was really that employers wanted to do the right thing. They were just scared of the liability. And so we looked at some other states and what they had done. Indiana, our border state, had passed something similar a couple of years ago. And so we basically crafted a bill, and we worked with some of our larger chambers of commerce on this as well as the recovery community, to basically put together a framework of basically a program that employers in Kentucky could follow if they wanted to be second chance employers. And if you followed this program and you kind of did the steps that this program set up, that was kind of run through the state, then a lot of your liability was taken away. Now, of course, this does not take away any kind of gross negligence or something like that, but it does kind of make sure that the fear of, hey, I really want to help this person, but what if they mess up and something happens? A lot of that can be taken away if you follow this program as an employer. And I will tell you, at the beginning of the session, we had a 60-day session. We thought, okay, this is a brand new bill. It's a brand new issue. We want to make sure it gets maybe through one chamber, and we'll see what happens. But as with any state, sometimes these issues take, a couple years to kind of get going. So I give our lobbyist, Kate Shanks, a lot of credit. This was kind of her baby during the legislative session. And we brought in people who were struggling with addiction, who had gotten that second chance. We had employers talk about wanting to give people a second chance, but worried about the liability. And again, it was kind of just putting faces to this story that we had talked about. And we passed it in the last couple of days of session overwhelmingly with broad bipartisan support, because everyone wanted to give these people who had gone through treatment, who were trying to get their lives back on track, who wanted to be good and upstanding citizens and work and pay their taxes and all these things we want people in recovery to do. We have to help them out by getting them a job. We know that a job is key to recidivism. And so by telling that story and by bringing the kind of addiction recovery community on board with it, we really made it about recovery, second chances. And it was also great that employers had, some protections in there as well. It wasn't broad blanket immunity by any means. Like I said, no, it wasn't gross negligence. Can't just write that off. But it does give employers some pretty important protections that they had never had before. So hopefully here in Kentucky, this bill will be able to allow employers that comfort they need to do the right thing and to give those people that second chance. And so I think it's a good model, kind of like Gary and I have talked about with the COVID-19, is painting the picture, telling that story when you're putting these people in front of legislators or the policymakers, instead of just kind of this broad idea or bringing attorneys in to kind of talk the legalese about it. Telling the story for us has seemed to work. And so it was a great model. We're sometimes even shocked that it passed as well as it did with its broad bipartisan support for kind of a first-year issue. But we're pretty proud of it, and we'd be happy to talk to other states who want to do something like this. If your state like ours has been struggling with addiction and getting people back to work, I think it's a really, really good model, a very applicable model, and something that both sides of the aisle can get on board with. So we're pretty pleased with it.
Well, Ashli, thank you for that example of how liability reform can help employers, employees, and the community at large, and congratulations on that achievement. Gary, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and ask you about a particular type of litigation. The North Carolina Chamber has been at the forefront of issues surrounding nuisance litigation. Your state has enacted reasonable reforms to prevent abusive nuisance litigation against the agricultural industry, for example. Are you concerned about COVID-related nuisance lawsuits?
You know, John, we're always concerned about the creativity of folks that are looking to create lawsuits against good companies that are working hard to feed our communities, to feed our state. And so we're always worried about how that a nuisance lawsuit can be brought against them. Right now, we haven't heard from the rhetoric that's been out there with some of the personal injury attorneys in particular, anything about using the nuisance statutes for looking at COVID class action or COVID related lawsuits, but that doesn't mean that the creativity won't be there. So we are vigilant about it. We are concerned that it could be applied. We're not hearing it right now, but we are thinking about ways to make sure that we protect the folks that are doing this really critical work. And if that's an avenue that folks are thinking of pursuing, we're already looking now and as to how we make sure that we protect folks against nuisance lawsuits that are related to COVID, just like we've worked to protect our agriculture industry. So we're aware, we are vigilant, and we are understanding of the creativity of folks that are looking to sue companies and people that are producing the food for our state, as well as people that are producing the PPE to protect our citizens. So we're ever vigilant, and we're looking at it closely.
Okay, thank you. We have our last question now to both Ashli and Gary before we go to our viewers' question and answer session. Since both of your states have been leaders to limit COVID-related litigation, do you think states are going to be able to address this issue on their own, or do either of you believe that a combined federal and state response is necessary? Ashli, I'd like to start with you.
Thanks. I definitely think it's going to be a combination. I think we've had success, in the last couple of months with our bill here in Kentucky, but we do know that more is needed. I think what we did was very much kind of while we were still in the thick of everything and wanting to protect manufacturers and frontline workers, we now know that I think some of those protections need to be extended to all employers. And you hear things like, if I get sick at work, can I sue my employer? And I always say, I've been at work many times and probably have gotten the flu and strep throat and all these kind of things, but you didn't hold your employer liable. So I think it's a new world we're now living in. So I do think we're going to be working here on the state level on some protections as well. But I do know that we are very much supportive of Leader McConnell talking about including legal reforms for employers in the next phase of whatever COVID-19 package comes out. We have sent him a letter about it. I know other state chambers of commerce, we've kind of gotten together to send him a letter just to encourage that, along with other congressional leaders. So I do think it's going to be a combination of both. Hopefully we in Kentucky will be able to expand our protections because we've kind of seen that it's needed and putting some common sense solutions to this issue. But we very much are supportive of a federal kind of fix as well. And I'm sure most states are probably looking at it like that as well.
Gary, would you give your perspective on whether or not this is a sort of a state-only issue, or whether there needs to be a combined sort of federal and state response to this problem?
Yeah, I think Ashli said it really well. It's a federal and state problem. I mean, the states have responsibilities for making sure that, and the authority to protect folks, and the federal government has responsibilities. And together, if we get good common sense federal and state legislation that protects and limits liabilities, it helps job creators create more jobs and produce more economic activity for our state in a safe and responsible way. So it's always best to make sure that we're in close communication with our federal folks, making sure we advocate for passage of common sense federal tort and civil liability reforms. And at the same token, we know where our state can adopt and enact those common sense reforms also to give the maximum amount of liability protection to good, hardworking folks that are in the businesses.
Okay, well, we're now going to go to our viewer question and answer period. And Gary, I'm going to give this first question to you, and it is, what stance have organized labor organizations taken with respect to these liability protection legislative efforts? And it goes on, in order to achieve the bipartisan support you've mentioned, have you needed to involve organized labor, and has that been challenging?
With regards to the reforms that we had here, we had strong bipartisan support from those members of the General Assembly who are close to organized labor. And again, because of some of the way it was structured, because of the medical community's involvement, and because of the narrowness of the time frame, which we need to really take a hard look at, which is a limitation of what we did. That being said, because of that, we had good bipartisan support, and we didn't have a lot of resistance. Now, we are a low unionized state to begin with in North Carolina, so we're a right to work state, so we have a good understanding of that across both sides of the aisle. So we'll talk to anybody, we'll work with anybody, but on what we passed so far, we didn't get a significant amount of resistance from the organized labor in the state or from those legislators who are known to work with organized labor pretty hand in hand. So far, so good. I think the challenges are ahead. And again, we'll talk with any folks that want to talk about common sense protections for employers. But so far, we've not had a lot of resistance from organized labor and are always willing to work with folks there and have in the past.
Okay, thank you. Ashli, this next question is for you, and it is, have you seen an uptick in COVID lawsuits and ads in Kentucky?
We have not yet. I every day can just imagine any of our trial bar attorneys kind of start saying, have you gotten sick at work or anything like that? I think Kentucky is kind of a hotbed for that. And so I do think it's probably coming. That's why we're really making sure that we want employers to follow the requirements the best they can, and so that they're very much in black and white. There's no gray areas. And I said, businesses want to follow the law. They want to protect all their employees, all Kentuckians, their patrons, but we do need to kind of know the requirements very clearly. And so we've just really been encouraging all businesses to get familiar with all the new reopening requirements, so that if that time does come, that they are protected. They had a log of what they have been able to do. Here in Kentucky, for example, we have to do health screen checks for every single employee that comes into a building every single day. So they have to take their temperature and kind of say if they've exhibited any of the symptoms of COVID-19, if they've been around anyone that has tested positive, all of this. And you have to answer those questions every day. And so I'm encouraging employers who say, is this really necessary? Can we do it, every couple of days? We're going to follow it every single day. I think it's very important for employers to make sure that we're following the guidelines to a T, because the less gray area, the better. But I would say, and I'm sure Gary would agree with this, over the last 2 months, here in Kentucky, business has done everything in their power to make sure all Kentuckians remain safe, even when that means closing down their own businesses, losing some of their livelihood. And they have done it because they knew that it was the right thing to do to make sure that everyone stayed safe. And here in Kentucky, we have had no bad actors. We have had no businesses that have said we're not going to close down, or have been breaking the rules, or have rushed to open too soon. We just haven't seen it in Kentucky. The business community has been overwhelmingly responsible and really looking out for the public health of all Kentuckians. And so knowing that moving forward, I know that they will act in the same way as we start to reopen, and really make sure that public health is at the center of everything as they reopen. And I just think that right now we're making sure that everyone's following the requirements the best they can, because I think all of us that have been in this world long enough know it's just a matter of time before those advertisements start coming.
Gary, I want to ask you this question first, and then I'll ask it of Ashli. What effects have you noticed after passing liability protections? For example, are more individuals willing to provide healthcare services? Are more businesses feeling secure enough to retool their production to make pandemic products, etc.?
They were doing that before because our healthcare professionals and our businesses were committed to doing the right thing to take care of their folks. So they were doing it all before. There hasn't been an increase because people were doing everything they could do before to protect the citizens of North Carolina as we were dealing with this pandemic. These were just put in place to make sure that good people doing good things weren't sued erroneously. And that's why they were put in place, because we knew if we didn't put reasonable, as Ashli said, common sense liability protections in place, that while we were going through this time, that people would be worried about and they would be getting sued for doing the right thing. And so these common sense liability protections are in place, but people were doing it and businesses were doing it. They were retooling as soon as they knew what the needs were, as soon as they knew that PPE needed to be produced. Large manufacturers were taking whole lines and producing N95 masks and beginning to do it and producing gowns and all the other things they needed to do before our General Assembly came in 3 or 4 weeks later to do our relief package. So right now they feel good. They're doing the things that they are doing. They are communicating to us, though, that, keep your eye on the ball. There were some missed opportunities in here, the effective dates. Make sure that as the effective dates and the state of emergency comes off, are there reasonable protections in place long term to protect the businesses? And we're going to be looking at that. We missed an opportunity to foreclose on class action lawsuits. So we're going to be taking a look at that piece too. And should there be reasonable limits on legal advertising? Yeah, there should be. And so as we go forward, a lot of people have pulled together to do the right thing to protect the citizens of North Carolina, the citizens of Kentucky, the citizens all over our country. And they need reasonable protections for people that are of goodwill doing the right thing to protect people from frivolous lawsuits. And so we're going to be ever vigilant about it. And people will continue to do the right thing, and we're going to do all we can to protect them.
Okay, thank you. Ashli, I'd like to give you a chance to answer that question. In Kentucky, what effects have you noticed after the Commonwealth recently passed its liability protections?
I think the immediate things that we've noticed are that our manufacturers are producing PPE and they feel comfortable with doing that. I think that's kind of been the overwhelming response that we've seen, is that it kind of, gave them some peace of mind to do what they needed to do and to do the right thing and produce the masks and the equipment that we needed. And so that was kind of the immediate result we saw. Besides that, we haven't seen probably much else. Besides, we all know that we passed it. We've been talking about it, which is good. And no one, I think this is interesting. I don't want to jinx myself. Everyone's talking about it as protection for people who are doing the right thing. And no one has really kind of said that it's tort reform, it's legal liability reform. And it's same with the second chance hiring bill that we passed around the same time. We're talking about protecting people who want to do the right thing, and that it's kind of, Good Samaritan type of issues. And so I think that's a really positive narrative, and I hope that narrative sticks around. But that's basically the reaction we've seen since passing it, I guess a little over a month or so ago now, was really our manufacturers have been able to produce this life-saving equipment that we really needed them to do. So it's been a positive reaction, but we have started thinking about what else we need to do to protect all employers.
Okay, well, it looks like that we are coming up on our time here today, and I'd like to thank our panelists and participants for joining us and giving us their perspective. I think it's fair to say that the state piece of the COVID liability issue is large and complex, but it's also a very important opportunity. And there's a tremendous challenge in front of us. And as we've talked about today, there's a lot of work to do. To our viewers, thank you for your questions and your attention. And please keep an eye out for our next white paper dealing with many of the issues that we talked about today and others. We'll be putting that on our website early next week. And until that time, thank you again for joining us, and please be safe out there. Thank you.